guest with me today. His name is Raymond Ibrahim. And Raymond is actually, I think, originally, or his ancestors are Egyptian, or his parents are Egyptian. He's a Middle East scholar. He's a scholar of the Quran, a scholar of wars and jihad in the Middle East, primarily in Europe, where they intersect. So I wanted to have him come on and talk to us about the real history of the authentic history of jihad from the very beginning. And we're going to hit some real highlights, if you want to call them that, from the very beginning with Muhammad and his four righteous followers, the four next caliphs, all the way up to, somewhere around today. Thank you for joining me, Raymond. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Elizabeth. Thanks for inviting me. Happy to be with you.
We're going to talk about jihad. And I guess what you should begin with, perhaps, is a brief introduction into how you got into this topic. You're an historian, and you were working at the Library of Congress, and you began to go through a whole uncatalogued room of books, and they were all in Arabic. And you, of course, are fluent in Arabic. And you said, okay, here's my project. I'm going to do this. And you found some very interesting things. Tell us about that.
Sure. So academically, as you indicate, I majored in history, and I was a student of Victor Davis Hanson at the time, who was really focused on military history. And so I really gravitated to that, and that's what I liked. And, my very first, my master's thesis was about the first battle between Muslims and Christians, the Battle of Yarmouk. It came out, I think, in 2001. Anyway, then I went to Georgetown University, and then I got a job at the Library of Congress, as you're indicating, where I worked with Arabic and other non-Middle Eastern language books. And being a bibliophile, I was like a child in a candy factory, because I had access to all these books, and I would spend a lot of time perusing through them. And I came across writings by Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri. This is around 2005 when I came across this, and I realized that they had not been translated, they had not been disseminated, and I had also found that they said the exact opposite of what Al-Qaeda had been saying to the West, and which was being disseminated by Western media, which was basically, they were saying, we attacked you 9/11 because you attacked us. This is, this is just retaliation. It's because of Israel. It's because of colonialism. There was a nonstop list of grievances. Okay. But then the writings that I found in Arabic said the exact opposite. It became a more theological argument against the West. And the long and short of it was basically, we have to hate and attack the West, Americans, etc., on just because they're infidels. Okay. So it was more like an ISIS type argument. All right. And long story short, I translated it. It became a book, was published by Doubleday in 2007. And then from that point on,
that's the Al-Qaeda reader, by the way. I highly recommend it. Yeah. I have it on my pad, as well as Sword and Scimitar. And I think it's a very, very important book. And I think it should be in the library of anybody who's going to be doing legislation or discussing anything, if they want to be authoritative on what the sources or the purpose and the reason for jihad is. It is not a defensive war, which is what we always hear when they go to the Quran. Well, that was just defensive. And we're only allowed to attack for defensive purposes. By the way, side note though here, do you think that one of the reasons why the press, the establishment press that is obviously usually anti-Israel and pro-Islam for some reason, that they don't report the truth on the motivations because they just never hear them and they don't dig deep enough to really, because I know the motivations because I listened to them translated from by memory from Arabic into English. To me, it seems pretty obvious to most people that it should be to most people that these are theological issues because they hate us because we do not accept Allah, Muhammad, the Quran, and their theology. Or do you think it's for other reasons?
No, I think your question is that why does the media not report on it? Is it intentional or what? At this point, it's absolutely intentional because it's my own personal experiences. When back in 2007, when the Al Qaeda came out, Al Qaeda Reader came out, was invited on all the mainstream media channels. And but then when I started saying what I started saying, which is gravitating towards more and proving that it's more of a theological and doctrinal thing, I was dropped off immediately. And the same people I was in contact with, they didn't want to hear it. They didn't even want to debate it. Okay. So that's my own personal experience. But I know this is just the case in general with even other people. Think about for one of the most obvious ways to prove this is, and okay, so talk about Israel and Palestine and that conflict, for example. It's okay to talk about Muslims attacking Israel, and it's not hard for the media to spin it or say whatever it wants because everyone sees the Muslims as the underdogs, and that's what an underdog does. He fights back. He even engages in terrorism, so it becomes logical. But what do you make of the fact that all around the Muslim world, where Muslims are dominant, they're persecuting Christians who are minorities and who are weak and who have nothing to do with creating grievances against Islam? They just want to practice their religion in peace, and yet they're being persecuted. So that is a major story. But the media goes out of its way, and I know this for a fact, never to cover it. And if they have to cover it because of some spectacular attack, 70 Christians were found decapitated in a church, then they start spinning it to the point where, in Nigeria, where there's a genocide of Christians, the official narrative by the media and politicians is this is about climate change, and it has nothing to do with religion. So they will go out of their way, and I know this for a fact, in 2015, when 20 or 21 Coptic Christians were beheaded by ISIS in Libya, and because they wouldn't recant their faith, that obviously they had to cover that. But someone did number crunching, and at the same time, the same day the video came out, I think some guerrilla called Hambra or something was killed in America, and that killing of the guerrilla got something like 10 times the coverage that 21
how
Christians.
Outrageous. A guerrilla dies. It must be imperialism or settler colonialism and white supremacism. Yeah. Okay. I guess I think we're pretty much on the same page. It just seems too intentional. So your book, Sword and Scimitar, which one of the reasons I love it is it's so succinct. This is a real recommendation because I have many, many books that just are overwhelming. And when you have little time anymore and X becomes your history class half the time, having a succinct book that spans history from Muhammad all the way up. Well, I can't remember which battle. I think it was it Constantinople?
I go to the Barbary Wars of America.
The Barbary. Oh, we're going to hit the Barbaries. Okay, so I just want to read, Victor Davis Hanson does the introduction or the forward to this book, obviously at the Hoover Institute, at Stanford, and I just wanted to read the last paragraph. Sword and Scimitar is first-rate military history and a product of solid scholarship and philological research. It characteristically offers candid appraisal of a rivalry that has now taken on quite different incarnations and played out on different fronts, from contemporary immigration to terrorism, but still in many ways remains an ancient existential struggle nonetheless. I read that because firstly, jihad has many forms, and I want to hit on that as we're having our conversations, which is exactly what he was saying right here. But what he points out is this is an ancient existential struggle. By existential, who's going to exist when the struggle is all over? Now, we're both Christians. We know how the story ends, but there's a lot of people that can be hurt. Nations can be brought down. Culture is destroyed in the meantime, and we're supposed to fight the good fight nonetheless. So let's get started with, let's just start from the beginning with Muhammad and how you would portray the militaristic jihadist and maybe even imperialistic desires of Muhammad, because I'm not quite sure from the Quran how explicit it is that they have to move out from the Arabian Peninsula and sweep across the world as they did.
Yeah. So as you indicated, it all starts with Muhammad, of course, and his particular teachings. I'm mostly interested in the bare bone background of Muhammad. Some people obsess about him and everything he said and did, and some tell you he doesn't exist. But the bare bone teachings is, and we have a lot of records for this, is basically he was a militant warlord who said he is a prophet and he promised paradise to his followers. And some people at the time, we have records of people calling him a false prophet and others following him. But the long and short of it is, the more his attacks grew on non-Muslims and, the plunder and the booty that came with it, the more his following grew until essentially he consolidated all of Arabia under the standard of Islam. And he dies in 632. And now, all these Arab tribes that were once fighting each other are one group. They're the Muslims, the Muslims, the believers. And the caliphs, the Rashidun that you mentioned, the first caliphs, they now launched them out to start conquering the nations surrounding them. And, where this teaching comes from later on, of course, you get the Quran compilations and you get Hadith, Sirah. And so for modern day Muslims, it all traces back to what we would call Islamic law, Sharia, which is based on specifically the Quran and the Hadith. And if you look at those and you read them, it's more so the Hadith, but it's in the Quran as well. It comes down to the succinct view that jihad is armed struggle against the infidel to bring them under the authority of Islam until Islam essentially governs the entire world. It's not, as some people would say, that you have to force the whole world to become Muslim. If you're a Christian and a Jew, you can live as what's called the dhimmi, second-class citizen, and you pay tribute, etc. And but if you're not, according to the literal teaching, you have to be slaughtered. And so that's why apparently more Hindus than any other non-Muslims were butchered through the centuries. Well, I think hundreds of millions is the number. But even then, the law essentially changed. It was better to just tax them and make money and just keep killing them. Anyway, so this is enshrined in Islamic teaching. It's a well-known aspect. It's jihad, and it blows up all around the world. Now, most people don't realize.
Wait a minute. Slow down. We got to come. Okay. I want to push back on one thing, and I want to clarify a few others. Muhammad brought the Arabian Peninsula under Islamic rule, though, by the sword. It wasn't that he gave them an opportunity, his fellow Arabs, to live as dhimmis, did he? Because I never really saw that. Obviously, he slaughtered Christians. He obviously slaughtered Jews, and his dying wish was that the Arabian Peninsula should be free of all Jews and all Christians forever, which did happen. I think his second successor, or first or second, made that happen. But this is my question. Was there any dhimmi status offered to the pagan Arabs in the peninsula?
Well, if you look at Muhammad's career and how it developed, it's actually, according to the Islamic teaching, standard mainstream Sunni teaching, it goes in essentially 3 phases. And the first phase is when he was weak and outnumbered and living in Mecca. And this is when he actually preached peace and tolerance and not armed struggle. And they're known as the Mecca verses. And this is why a lot of the apologists, this is what they get away with. They cite and cherry pick the Meccan verses, which say things like, you have your religion, I have mine, and it sounds good. Okay, then at one point in, 622, year 1 of the Hijra or the Islamic calendar, he flees to Medina, and now he starts growing in power. And then the message starts shifting to, now you can fight them back if they attack you. But then he continues growing in power and consolidating, and more and more people submit to his political authority, becoming Muslims. And now the final stage comes out, which is now you have to go on the armed offensive. This is the classic definition of jihad. And so these latter verses are referred to as the Medinan verses. So if you look at the Quran, you have the Meccan verses, which are older, and you have the Medinan verses, even though they're kind of mixed together. It's not written in a chronological It's not ordered that way, so it gets a little confusing.
So for Christians and Jews and anybody else who reads the scriptures, the Bible, and then looks at the Quran, I want to point something very, very quickly out, that when they ordered the Quran, they did something that I've never heard in my entire life. Maybe, I don't know, I've never heard. The chapters, if you will, are organized the longest to the shortest. And so so it's very easy to be deceptive when you're a Muslim apologist, because so nobody really knows. Here's the Meccan passages that were at the beginning of his mission, if you will, and then here are the Medinan. And so you have to go by what Muslim scholars and later other scholars say as the order of, or the separation between the Medinan and Meccan. And so, like you said, you have my religion, I have my religion. That's gone. 920, chapter 9 is really important chapter, I would say, in describing what the final theology or political theology of Muhammad was. And that is what? Do you want to?
Right, yeah. So I think what you're referring to is also known in Islamic law in Arabic as an-nasikh wal-mansukh, which means abrogation. And so basically in Islamic teaching, if there's a contradiction, and there are in the Quran, the newer verse that came out, the Medinan verses, takes precedence. Okay, so which means that, as you mentioned, Surah Al-Tawbah, chapter 9, that's the most militant one. It's the Medinan ones. And it has two of what's called the two sword verses. One is 9:5 and the other is 9:29. And just taken together, they declare all-out jihad on everyone, including Christians and Jews. And according to Islamic exegetes, those two verses have abrogated something like 120 peaceful verses. But there's also another interesting element to it. Other Muslims say, and this makes perfect sense, they say because Muslims follow the example of Muhammad. That's what the word Sunni means, example. And they say, so we can actually follow the verses that apply to us, including we can give precedence to the Meccan verses, which are peaceful, over the Medinan ones if we are in the same situation. So what they mean by that is, if I'm a Muslim and I'm living as an outnumbered minority amongst infidels in a Western nation, I should preach peace, okay, as a sort of stratagem. I shouldn't obviously declare jihad because I'm going to get myself killed or thrown in jail, and it's totally ineffective, and it's just going to make Islam look bad. So Muslims believe they can use these verses depending on their own circumstances and match the life of Muhammad. And I'll just share with you one very telling anecdote that occurred when I was at the Library of Congress. There were many Muslims that worked there, and one of them I was very friendly with, and we would always, speak. We would talk about these topics. And I would challenge him. We'd have like a interfaith dialogue sort of thing. But it was kind of in a bantering, friendly way. And I mentioned this whole thing to him. And at first he tried to act ignorant. He was talking about the Meccan verses and just telling me, no, but man, it's all about peace. You see, there's this, there's this. And I broke down what I just said to you. And I said, well, wait, this is Mecca. And then Muhammad, when he moves on and it becomes Medina, this and that. And he finally got frustrated and goes, well, what do you want from me? I'm living in Mecca. So his point is,
oh, that is hysterical. That is a great little anecdote. I love that. Because we know anyone who, I can't imagine how all Americans don't know this by now. And I think that there is sort of some kind of a tipping point. I don't know when it began or if it's yet to begin, where most Americans will understand that things like Hudaybiyah, Taqiyya, all the Meccan verses, abrogation, it's talked about so much. And this is why it's important to just keep talking about it. So this is a form of taqiyya, and this is the permission given by Muhammad to lie. He lists 3 items. One is lie to your wife if it makes her feel better about something, and lie to in war. War is deception, right?
Deception. Yeah.
I don't know if you read The Art of War. If you had an Arabic copy of The Art of War, and I can't remember the third item that he said.
You can lie to two quarreling parties to reconcile them.
Okay, yeah, there you go. So this Muslims consider themselves to be when they're in the West, they are still in a state of war. It's just a different kind of holy war. I advocate that we use the term jihad instead of terrorist all the time. I advocate that we actually use the words that identify them, identify the reality more specifically, instead of saying, extremists or radicals or terrorists, that we talk about jihadists and Shariaists, I call them as well. The one pushback I had for you, I've trained myself to never say the words second-class citizens, because dhimmis are not second class and they are not citizens. What they are a despised minority. Even when they're in the majority, they're in the minority. They do not rule, and they're subjugates, and they have essentially only the rights that a capricious ruler will allow them to have, and they are in total submission, unlike I don't know, probably like some other societies in history. Go to ancient Japan, ancient China, and other places, but this is carrying that kind of subjugation into the modern world. And so I just essentially say they're a despised minority, subjected to all Muslims, all, not just leaders, but all Muslims within the under which they find themselves subjugated. That's not a very shorthand way of saying it. You can shorten that. But do you agree that they're not really second class citizens? They're more like third and fourth, almost closer to a slave.
I do agree with that. And in fact, if you look at some of my older videos, I would say third-class citizens. But then I had people ask me, like, what do you mean by that? And technically, it means this. So what you just said, I do agree with. And, second-class citizen, it depends on the context, what one means. But yes, despised minority who are barely tolerated and live according to the priests of the rulers is pretty accurate. And also the constant uprising of Muslims, even if the ruler is kind towards them. Oftentimes Muslims would just rise up against them, and then the ruler would, of course, turn a blind eye because it's easier for him to, let the Muslims have their own way because they're the majority. And, this continues paralleling in modern day. If you look at Egypt, some of the stuff that happens, a Coptic man, whatever, eloped with a Muslim woman, all of a sudden an entire city is destroyed, or a village of Christians is attacked.
And the Basilica of St. Mark.
Right, yeah. And or attacks on churches because the cops met in a house and tried to pray. I only mention those because if you actually look at the history, and there's a great book that came out a few years ago, it's called The Sword Over the Nile by Adil Gindi, and it's basically based on the primary sources of the Egyptian chronicles during the Islamic conquest and thereafter, like every century, basically, from the entry of Islam till the modern era. And you see the same exact parallels of what I just described happening today, happening then. Okay, so yeah. So a dhimmi, I often just use the words. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible for, Americans who don't understand the subtle technicalities of Islamic terminology. But a dhimmi is not a second-class citizen. It's definitely much worse and along the lines that you mentioned.
So let's move out of the Arabian Peninsula. Suddenly it's, 732?
Yeah, 732.
632.
Yeah.
Well, 630, we were going to get to Battle of Tours in a minute. 632, is that when Muhammad died? Okay, then the first caliph, was that Ali or was that
Abu Bakr?
Abu Bakr. And so he and his armies move out of the Arabian Peninsula. Tell us what happens next.
Well, actually, Abu Bakr's reign is only 2 years, and he also, when Muhammad dies, a lot of the Arabian tribes that had come under his tutelage break away. And actually, Abu Bakr, the first caliph's short reign, is typified by what's called the Ridda Wars, which is these wars against the apostate Arab tribes because they had tried to break away from Islam, and he brought them back in through a much bloodshed. So it's really under the second Caliph Omar, who reigns from, I want to say 634 to 643 or something, about 10 years. And that's when really the great Arab conquests begin, and they spread out and they go and attack greater Syria, which encompassed, of course, all the modern day states of Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, etc. It's referred to in the sources really as greater Syria, and in Egypt as well. So Egypt gets conquered by 641. Syria is conquered in 636, very, very quickly. And then after that, they fall like dominoes. But I think the part that a lot of Westerners miss is, and this, I only say this because it comes out a lot, but I don't think most people understand or have an idea of how Christian that region was at the dawn of Islam. Yes, you probably know what I mean, but a lot of Westerners, let's say, like the Christians of the Middle East today being persecuted, they'll say, yeah, we sympathize, but why would they go and live there? Which, of course, is a reflection of how they have no idea that area is the oldest
don't know
Christian
the history.
region.
And that's what, this is why the purpose of these kinds of conversations, because it was the Eastern the Eastern Roman Empire, the Eastern Christendom was the vast majority of Christendom at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah, at the time of that, we're talking about 630s or whatever. If you talk about Christendom, it's in precisely the countries that we're talking about. It was Greater Syria, Egypt, Asia Minor, Anatolia. This is why Constantine moved the capital, Rome, to Constantinople or Nova Roma, New Rome, which is in modern-day Turkey, essentially, because Christianity was really, and it was in Europe as well, southwest of the Rhine and Danube, but it was really entrenched more in the countries that we today call the Muslim world, and North Africa and the Middle East. So you had five major sectors.
Let's underscore this here. It's really important to remember this. Islam is many things. You could describe it many ways, but it is imperialistic and it is colonial. So when we hear today about settler colonialism and, the reason for all the poverty and the wars and everything, it's because of what the white European males did and their settler colonialism and the Jews. Let's just keep in mind this. Firstly, that's a bunch of garbage. But Islam conquered all of Eastern Christendom. And they did it by force. And so it is an imperialistic, colonial, jihadist ideology and religion. And so whoever is left there standing still, the Copts in Egypt, the Assyrian Christians, et cetera, Jews are only there. I mean, they're there because that was their home, and Islam, through suppression and the force of Sharia law and violence, made it Islamic. So it is not indigenously, if you want to use that term, Islamic, which they actually, I think most people out at Columbia, those students think that Islam has the right to all of the land, the dirt. Go over, pick up the dirt in any place in the Middle East and North Africa, and this is Muslim dirt. That's their soil.
Yeah, it's even worse than that. It's just, if you ask, and this is what I was sort of alluding to earlier, if you talk to your average Westerner, they just have no clue that Muslim lands were formerly Christian lands. And this is by design, because if they were Christian lands originally, it means there was conquest and colonization, enforcement of the Islamic identity and the Arabic language. And you mentioned colonization and you mentioned conquest, but you also forgot slavery, which is another of the white man's sins, but it was actually really perfected by these Arab caliphates at the time. And, if you look at some of the sources of the early years, it looks like mass slave trade going on, especially, for example, of the Berbers in North Africa in the 7th century, where it talks about tens and thousands of them being chained and hauled off until they became Muslims and they became the front line of the Islamic jihad and so forth. But yeah, so that is the conquest. And it wasn't just Eastern Christendom. If you look at the map, it was literally 3/4 of the Christian world was swallowed up, because we're talking of all of North Africa, all of the Middle East, Spain, okay,
which is huge.
Deep into
part of France,
which is a huge peninsula, part of France, all of the Mediterranean islands, all of these were, of course, Christian for centuries. And they got, some of them were, Spain, of course, went through the Reconquista. So it was like 800 years of Islam and jihad, et cetera.
And I want to
And then,
get to
and this is,
Spain in a minute because I want to talk about a Reconquista for Europeans in the future if they ever have the guts to do something about the war that they've been fighting and sleeping through at the same time. When we talk about the slave trade, I think it's worth going in just another minute or two that the West African slave trade, and then the white slavery, which is essentially Muslims going into Europe, even over to Iceland. I don't know if they ever got to Greenland. It's an important place today, but up to Iceland, and there would be farmers in the fields in Great Britain, and ships would land, and Muslims would come ashore and take women, children, adults, men, and take them back to North Africa and sell them as slaves and sex slaves. And this happened to the tune of millions. I mean, I think that there's at least a minimum of 4.5 million white slaves because during, I don't know what the period of time was.
Well, the period of time is from the dawn of Islam and all the way until it gets abolished, really, by Western European colonial powers. But the numbers, for example, we know like in the 1500s, during this time when Iceland was being attacked, there were about 1.25 million slaves in Barbary or North Africa. And this is to say nothing about the really large slave trades, the Ottomans, who had, we're talking about the conquest of Christian territory, 3/4. And I mentioned Spain and North Africa and the Middle East. But then we forget, as time progressed, now Asia Minor, one of the most ancient Christian regions, becomes Turkey, and the Balkans get conquered. And they also are, like Spain, they too are temporarily conquered under Islam and experience the same sorts of abuses and enslavement. The word slave comes from the word Slav, because the Slavic peoples were so enslaved by the Ottomans and the Crimean Tatars, also Muslim. And those sources talk about, again, many millions during this time. And that's why the word Slav, to be a Slav, was to be a slave. And so the word slave,
and
etymologically, black people, it's white people.
Right. And here we're jumping to, and I'm just making this note for people who are listening and haven't yet memorized their jihad timeline. We're talking about the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, Muslims, began essentially around 1400, 1450. I'm not sure exactly the exact date, but and they had also this other kind of slavery, which was particularly heinous when you think about it. Well, first I want to mention the fact that we get the word Balkanization to describe a region that is literally always in ethnic, religious, cultural strife, war, genocides, just, violence ongoing because of differences. How did Balkanization arise? Well, when you take when you take a Christian region, because we're talking Europe here, and then you enslave it under Islam, and you either force or you have many Muslims that either move into the area colonially or others convert by the sword or otherwise. Now you've just baked in ongoing, centuries-long ethnic, cultural, religious strife. So that's Balkanization. But Dev Shirim or Dev Shirmay, it's hard for me to pronounce that word frequently, but that was a particularly heinous thing. We're still in the Ottoman Empire, so we're after the 1400s. They would actually take tribute in the form of forcing families in, I think is pretty much Greece, but you can correct me there, to give up their most beautiful, intelligent, most athletic little boys to be hauled off and converted to Islam and put into the military. So tell us a little bit about that and correct my pronunciation of Dev Shirmay.
Yeah, the Dev Shirmay is basically, it was this And I hope I don't forget, but after I tell you what it is, I want to tell you what modern academic Western people portray it as. But basically, it was this institute by the Ottomans, which was if you're a subject, and it was essentially just against Christians because we're talking about Eastern Europe. This is where it develops. So they were all Christian subjects, and the Ottomans would send their men to these tributaries who've been broken down and defeated, and other subjects, their dhimmis, and they would demand the healthiest, the smartest, the handsomest boys from whatever age. It could be as 6, 10, 12, and they would haul them off to become either warriors, which became the Janissaries, or the Yansari, which basically means new soldiers, new warriors, and they were converted to Islam and essentially indoctrinated in jihadist ideology. And then it was like a very vicious cycle, because then they would let them loose again on the Christians, their own former relatives, and they would conquer some more and take more children. So they were basically bleeding them dry of their best genetics, their own pool, to use them into their own military.
Whenever I think about this, and I think of these people just trying to survive under the oppression of Muslim domination and rule and Sharia, and to think that you have a little baby boy, you've got a couple of little girls, you have a little baby boy, he gets to be 6 or 8 years old, and the I don't know if they were caliphs there or sultans or sometimes I get confused with their nomenclature. Sultans, and they come riding in for their annual or semi-annual or every 3 or 4 years, whatever it is, and they have to line up all the little boys in the village. Every little boy, no one is exempt. And then they just go through, and you're holding your breath, and some even scarring their children so that they would not be fit to serve.
Or maiming them. Yeah.
Maiming them, breaking an arm or doing something to a foot. It is a horror. And that was the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans, and here we are skipping forward, so we got to go backwards in a minute. But just remember this. When France and England and other nations went up against the Germans and the Ottomans in the First World War, and the Ottoman Empire, as well as the German Empire, was broken up, these are those people. This is right before the League of Nations. This is what the League of Nations came out of this war. And this is where they took these oppressed lands, a 400-year suppression. Well, it actually goes back to Muhammad, of course, but that particular last Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans, they broke it up, and 99% was given to Muslims. Either the Turks kept some, a big chunk of it, too big, and the Arabs got the rest, and then Israel got 1.2%, 12%, as I figured it. Just take my word for it. So they got 1% of it. This is the kind of empire that was ruling, that was broken up and divided into states. So when we have this idea that you get filled up with that, France and England came in and took the Muslim Middle East, it was peaceful, everything was hunky-dory, everything was great, and then they just carved it up and of course there's always ulterior motives as well, but they carved it all up and gave it to the Jews, essentially. None of that is true. They carved up a wicked, wicked empire and ended, for a time, the caliphate, which was probably one of the greatest things that happened in history. Let's go back. Let's go to the Battle of Tours. I want you to describe what the Battle of Tours was. What was at risk? How did it end? And what were the fate of those who were killed?
Sure, but I'll just make one last comment about the Janissary. So what you described is true, and actually the sources talk about when they would come and pick these boys. Mothers would be hysterically crying. Some fathers would get killed because they would try to prevent a seizure of their sons. And now here's the thing. If you grab an academic book today and you read about it, there are literally academic scholars who present this as a sort of, it was a good thing. It was a scholarship to Oxford because these were poor peasant Christians, and they took their sons, and if you became a janissary, you became rich and powerful and a noble figure in the Ottoman Empire. So supposedly they wanted to be recruited and taken away from their families, even though the sources talk about them crying and fighting and trying to escape and being killed.
You
So it
never
can
listen to Islamic sources when you're writing Islamic history. Now, that is the rule of thumb. If you're going to talk about modern history, news reports, if you're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire, anything, you can't use the Islamic sources. Why?
well, but
Because
sadly, what I'm telling you is these are Western sources
that's what I'm
that
saying. No, my point is that the Western historians are never going to report what's actually in the record,
right,
the
right,
contemporary
right, right.
record.
Yeah,
I mean, when
yeah.
you look at these histories, many of Muhammad's chroniclers and those of the caliphs and the Ottomans and all the rest of them, they had chroniclers, and they're telling it from a firsthand eyewitness history about flaying men alive, cutting their skins off of their entire body alive. But we can't, but that never seems to make it into Western histories of jihad. I mean, of Islam. That was my point. So
Yeah.
tell me,
And
take me
that's
to the
why
Battle of. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's why this is what you're saying is the reason I wrote Sword and Scimitar, because it's, and I assume you read it, you said you read it. So I'm sure a lot of it was kind of shocking and surprising because it's so opposite of what being taught in schools. But what's being taught in schools, where's it traced? It goes back to John Esposito of Georgetown University and Karen Armstrong. Okay. But what I wrote is actually the sources. It's the Arabic Muslim sources. It's the Christian chronicles of the time. And they relay that much different picture. They show you Islam always behaving like ISIS on steroids, essentially. So this is the great divide, unfortunately, where modern people are subject to these secondary histories, which
And
are essentially whitewash.
our children are indoctrinated. What's his name? Khalid Rashidi at Columbia, and so many other of these Middle East studies teachers, and Edward Said. He was not Middle East studies, but it's literally propaganda, indoctrination under the guise of historic scholarship. And some of it's very thin. I mean, it's almost comical, laughable, but others present themselves well as if it's true history. It is not. And you have to read like Sword and Scimitar, or I happen to have Robert Spencer because I talked to him for a couple hours the other day. The history of jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. I really wasn't surprised by your book at all because I know enough of it. But I just loved how you really laid it out very systematically and fully, and the breadth of it really, really good. So they conquer. How far did they get at the beginning? I'm never quite sure about this. I know they go quickly across northern Africa. They go into Spain very quickly, and they're challenging southern France, where the Battle of Tours eventually was in, I think, 732. But I can't quite get my head around how far north. Did they just go up to Syria? Were the Armenians affected by like the second caliph?
So you know what? I have in my hand Sword and Scimitar, and I have a map in here, which I'm gonna try to show. I don't know if you can see it, but the map, you see, all those dark regions are formerly Christian regions that were permanently conquered. The gray ones are Christian regions that were temporarily conquered, like Spain and the Balkans. And the stripes are raids. So if you can see, it's almost like everything but the center of Europe was one way or another impacted and affected. All right. So basically, from the beginning that we started, 634, which is really the first major battle of Aishin, until, let's say, the siege of Vienna in 1683, almost 1,000 years. Okay, 3/4 of Christendom conquered, everything, like I mentioned, North Africa, the Middle East, Spain, portions of France, all the Mediterranean, later on Asia Minor, and then all of the Balkans, all the way up until Vienna. But also, as you indicated, Iceland is being raided, England is being raided, Denmark is being raided for slaves. Okay, so it's just amazing that was the reality. And now what historians do and what the academics do is when they talk about conflict, it starts with the colonial era, because everything before that was fine, except, of course, for the Crusades. And the Crusades are another blot, and they're presented in a vacuum. I have a quote from John Esposito, the professor at Georgetown, where he basically says, 5 centuries, he basically says everything before the First Crusade between Muslims and Christians was nothing but peace and love. And then the First Crusade just ruined it all, and all these evil Christian Catholics decided to go and colonize the Middle East. He doesn't tell you how actually Muslims during those peaceful centuries conquered 3/4 of the Christian world. In one year alone, I often say this, but one caliph from Egypt in the year 1009 destroyed 30,000 churches, okay, under his rule, including the Holy Sepulchre, the church that's built atop the resurrection site of Christ. But they won't talk about that. They'll bring it in in a vacuum and say, oh yeah, the First Crusade, those evil guys, out of the blue, they just decided to go and attack poor Muslims. And then they fast forward from that to the colonial era. And once again, it's evil Christians going into Muslim lands, doing what they're doing, etc.
This is a crime against our country, and I don't use that term unintentionally, and I don't think it's an overstatement. I don't think you can go to prison for it, though I think that I would like to figure out a way we could do that and retain our First Amendment. But this is a crime against America. Most certainly, Europe has lost its mind. I remember reading very recently that the Vikings are being discussed as they were actually Muslims because supposedly on some Viking ware, some artifact that was found, they found what they were going to interpret as the word Allah in this needlepoint kind of stitching on some Viking gear. It was clearly not Allah, but even in Norway, even in Viking lands, they're being told that, of course, a brand new history. So
there is a connection between the Vikings and the Muslims, and it's also unflattering. And a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of the Viking raids, slave raids on other European nations, England, Ireland, France, etc., was to enslave. And we know they enslaved a lot of people, but it was specifically so they can sell them to the Arab caliphates who preferred white slaves. Mm-hmm. And we know this for a fact because if you do look at the golden horde coins that are found in Viking burials, they're all Arab coins. So what exactly were Arabs buying from these Vikings? What commodity did they have? We know what they had. They had a lot of white slaves. So there is that connection.
That's very true. Yes, white slavery was a booming business. It'd probably be multi-billion dollars today if you did the math and brought it up to date. So I am probably, I'm not maybe famous, but if I were, I would say I'm famous for having these wide-ranging conversations. I start off with all these great intentions, but the side little trails are so important, and maybe contextually it's good to go there.
14 centuries, it's inevitable.
Yes. So the reason I brought up the map is because recently when I was looking at Vienna, and I was looking at where Islam had gotten to, I believe at the Battle of Vienna, and here I am skipping ahead again, I saw that it was closer, if this was an accurate map, that the Muslims had taken the land closer to Kiev than they had even gotten to Vienna. And I was utterly shocked. I couldn't believe that it went all the way up into Ukraine, all the way up, basically a Sunday's stroll from Kiev. That's how bad it was. But let's go back to the Battle of Tours.
No, but you're moving an important point, which I'd actually like to add to. But, a lot of people don't realize even Russia was conquered and subjugated and suffered all the same things that we're discussing, including mass slavery by Muslims. But this doesn't really come out amongst historians because they don't say they're Muslims. They say they're Mongols or Tatars, the Golden Horde, which was a Mongolian empire. But if you look at it, it was actually a Muslim empire as well. And if you look at the sources, you realize that those Mongols were, again, citing the Quran, citing the jihadist ideology, citing everything that we're talking about in their enslavement and subjugation of the Russians. So, it's called the Tatar yoke often. But again, it's part of this long war of Islam on Christendom. And people, again, don't realize that Russia also suffered it for centuries.
That's so true. And I have not read that much about that. I just have that cursory understanding that they went up into Russia. But when I think about how grand and wide and deep this threat to the West was, and we're going to get to the founding fathers a little bit later if we still have time, because I want to do a little parallel from the 1600s on with America. But it's so tragic. Most empires, well, I like to say that the history of the world is a history of empire. You cannot tell the story of the world without empire and slavery. And so that means it goes back very, very far. And when you look at Babylonia, Assyria, the Hittites, I mean, we're not even going to go there, of course. That was the time of the Torah and the prophets and Israel. All of those were Middle Eastern, brown-skinned, if you want to say that, empires, the Persians, the Medes, the Elam, all that. It wasn't until Greeks in Rome, Mediterraneans, of course, did they ever get to the Vatican? Because my understanding was that they got to the Vatican and that they ripped up some bones of perhaps St. Peter, St. Paul. But then someone I was speaking to the other day was saying, oh, no, they never went into Italy. And I thought, okay, I need to get that answered. Tell me, Raymond, did they go into...
Oh, they most certainly invaded and terrorized Italy. And one of the most famous was the city of Otranto. And this is, I want to say in 1480, the Ottomans, the Turks invaded it, and they ritually, savagely killed the Christians there. They gave them the option to convert or not. And I have it in my book. It's in Sword and Scimitar. I discussed it at length, but basically they tortured and beheaded and killed something like 1,000 Christians. And they took their archbishop and sawed him in half. And until now, if you go to the Cathedral of Otranto, you can look it up online. They have their skulls in glass cases because they're the martyrs of Otranto. So that's just one attack on Italy. As far as Rome and the Vatican, etc., yeah, actually, Muslims did attack it. It's a very little known anecdote, which was in the mid-9th century. I want to say around 856.
I don't think that's a small little thing. I mean, to me,
I know it's not.
Like when they take Jerusalem. By the way, we've been talking about Christendom, and I do want to point out that it's just an oversight that we're not saying it's also was home of the Jews. I mean, in the Arabian Peninsula, obviously, if the Muslims were slaughtering the Jews were there first because Islam came after. There was many Jews in Yemen. And of course, all over the Middle East, Babylon, now Iraq, Persia, of course, that's where Daniel and Esther and all the rest ended up. So, but just not as great numbers were the Jews. So it was primarily Christian, but the numbers were not as great. So I didn't want to say that. I don't think, when they conquer, invade, subject Judea, or Judah and Judea, depending on how you want to look at it, and Jerusalem. And when they do the same to Rome, and I'm not Catholic, though my mother said, because I was born Catholic, I'm always Catholic, so maybe I am. Just so note. Are you Catholic or Orthodox? Or I get a feeling from Orthodox. I figured you were Orthodox. Anyway, I think taking Rome, and the fact, doesn't Muhammad and his followers, don't they call like the West Rome? I mean, isn't there a word that they use in Arabic?
No, yeah, Rum. They refer in the early Arabic sources. Usually they're talking about what now modern historians call Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, but it was Rome to the Arabs because it was Rome. And so they refer to it as Rum. And oftentimes it gets conflated with much of the West. But then by the time the French, the First Crusade comes, then the main word becomes franc. Maybe you even know the word. which still exists till today. If you say someone is a Frangi, means he's westernized. But it comes from,
Interesting,
you know,
interesting.
it
So
means he's a
the
Frank.
the idea that I hear Muslims all the time now say, you know, uh, that one of the top priorities in the jihad against the West is to take Rome and put a flag of the caliphate over the Vatican. I
Yeah.
don't think that
So
the
originally,
modern, I'm sorry, I don't think that the current pope really considers that a threat.
no, this has been from the very beginning and goes back to Muhammad. And he wanted to see the conquest of Rome, which to him in his time was Constantinople.
Constantinople, yeah.
Okay. And so that was one of the longest, the goals of every jihadist. And they attacked it right
Took a
from the
thousand
get-go.
years.
Yeah, yeah. They started attacking it in the 650s, soon after Muhammad's, death. And it was finally conquered, almost 1,000 years in 1453. But then they also wanted Rome because by 1453, Rome now is a grown power. It wasn't. It was, under barbarian rule during the time of Muhammad. That's why they looked at Constantinople. But they also the reason they wanted Vienna too was it was the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. So a lot of the cities that they really focused on was for the religious symbolic elements because it was seen as the heart of Christendom. And of course, Islam must conquer it and break the cross and subjugate it. So until now, you have Muslims and ISIS and so forth clamoring about how they need to conquer Rome. And again, that goes all the way back to the beginning, that sort of idea.
You know, I would like to take another divergence. I may have to have you back to actually do the little sword and scimitar step through each battle because it is a military history, and we're not really staying on that timeline. But whatever, we're having fun. I'm having fun. I want to talk about the Muslim lake, the Mediterranean. And when I read, oh my gosh, Muhammad and Charlemagne, or there's a couple of books, a Frenchman wrote it, very small.
Henry Perrin, yeah.
Perrine?
Yeah, Henry Perrin.
Henry Perrine,
yeah.
or I think of him as Henri, but anyway, I thought that was one of the most enlightening things I ever learned. And to me, it has to do with one, rewriting of history, and I'm going to let you tell it. Rewriting of history, cultural appropriation of the great heights of art and intellect and medicine and science by Islam, which is a normalized thing. Also, the architecture taking when they're not burning 1,000 churches, they're converting basilicas and cathedrals into churches, and then saying, into mosques and saying, look at our gorgeous architecture. But that changed. That was one of those paradigm shifts that utterly changed my view of history. That when think about, I'm going to tell you. Tell us about looking at the Mediterranean pre-Islam and post-Islam and what it ended up doing to Christendom and the Dark Ages and all that stuff.
Yeah, sure. So, and this goes back to the Henry Perrin thesis. He came up with the idea in the 1800s. This is still at the time when historians will talk about a dark age descending on Europe. And generally it starts, they give different dates, but maybe 700 till 900 or 1,000. And his point, which is a very salient and accurate point, is really it's the Islamic conquest that we've been discussing, that literally led to this dark age, specifically by the appropriation of what was once known as the Roman lake, the Mediterranean, which was the highway for all those countries. This is why Egypt and Rome and Spain and Asia Minor and the Holy Land were all interconnected as part of the Roman Empire. And with the Islamic conquest that we were discussing in the 7th century, it completely severed it because now the southern part was all conquered, it was all Islamized, and all you had was the north, which, as I mentioned earlier, was actually the poorer, more impoverished, and less developed region of the Christian world. And so, as one example, papyrus ceased to be imported from Egypt to Europe. Therefore, literacy rates dramatically fell. That's one example that someone like Perrin refers to. his book is called Charlemagne and Muhammad, and he makes the famous line where without a Muhammad, there would be no Charlemagne, because all the development that happened in Western Europe and the rise of Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, was a reaction to what Islam had been doing. And so really the Dark Ages, once again, it's a reflection of what Islam did. Also, this is also the time when the Viking pagans are attacking and other nomadic tribes from the east are sweeping in. But it's really the Islamic conquest that had the most impact on it. As far as the other point, I think you're referring to, a lot of the golden age that's often allotted to Islamic civilization, which was really an appropriation of the civilizations that they had conquered. And this is true as well. If you look at a lot of the thinkers and the philosophers amongst the Muslims that always heralded as great thinkers, etc., you find that they're either recent converts to Islam who were Christians and Muslims,
and Jews
almost
before.
always, or I'm sorry, yeah, Christians or Jews who had been just recently converted, or were their parents, just for practical reasons, but they still brought the sort of Christian Jewish background, heritage, and knowledge, and so forth. And again, it's also important that one of the biggest lines here again is how history is so distorted. One of the biggest lines is that the Muslims saved Aristotle and brought him back to Europe. So Europe owes Muslims thanks. But what they don't tell you is it's the Muslims' attack on Europe that created this discontinuity that caused Europe to lose Aristotle in the first place, based on what I said, this discontinuity through the Mediterranean. So if it wasn't for the Muslims, Europe would have never lost Aristotle or anyone else to start with. They didn't need the Arabic translations from the original Greek.
You know what it's like? Exactly. And by the way, I read the book so many years ago, I can barely remember it, How the Irish Saved Civilization. So there's two competing theories there, but it's almost like this, a great analogy of Muslims move into the West, go into Europe, and when they're in the foreign land, the Christian lands, they're more radicalized because they are at war, as opposed to in Middle Eastern and North Africa nations. They own it, and they've got a dictator or a hardcore monarch over and above them. So there's no place for jihad and radicalization there, or there's much less. Obviously, there's tons of violence against Muslim. But you move into the West and you're at war, whether it's violence, whether it's birth, whether, demographics, etc. You are at war. You move in intentionally in massive numbers into a place that you say is filled with infidels and everything about it is wicked and sinful. And then you claim Islamophobia. You accuse everyone of Islamophobia. So you caused the problem, because if you stayed in Muslim lands under Sharia with Muslim monarchs and Muslim presidents, and you could live and everybody's wearing niqab and all the rest, you'd have nothing to be upset about. You move to the place where you can be the belligerent, and then you call them Islamophobes. And so what you're saying here is the Muslim jihad, holy war, this is their holy war, takes over the Roman lake, makes it a Muslim lake, and this grand sea of commerce, of exchange of culture and religion and trade and wealth. And just imagine the Mediterranean prior to Islam, and all paper, unless it was leather. Okay, if you had, why I'm looking for a leather Bible. I don't have, I'm trying to think of like a skin, where the paper is made out of skin. Anyway, papyrus was the cheap way to make paper. It was all made out of papyrus. Europe was absolutely literate. And obviously, what did the Apostle Paul write on originally? A lot of it was papyrus, and then later, of course, on leather. But if literally in the United States today, well, we have computers. Forget computers. In the 1940s, if all paper dried up and not one piece of paper could be found in all of our nation, what would happen to literacy at that time? That's just one of the effects of the belligerence and the warmongering of Islam. And then didn't he also speak, Henri, about how all of the populations that lived on those beautiful coastlines, I'm thinking Capri, it's so beautiful, that they moved far from the coastlands. And so all of their lands, their farms, their history, their heritage, family farms and their villages emptied out because and those who were left were impoverished because one, they would either be enslaved by raiders, and they just didn't want to be the victims of raiding.
Yeah, this is the start of feudalism. So all the people who lived on the coasts, if they stayed there, Muslim raiders and enslavers would come and get them. So they started gravitating to the powerful nobles, and they became,
for protection.
This is the beginning of feudalism. Yeah, for protection. And they worked on their land because the alternative was to continue living near the coast and becoming a slave for the Muslims.
Yeah, it changes so much. Again, I'm going to say it's a crime because the reality is that this is not really complicated history. There are a lot of complicated histories, like the Israeli-Arab conflict. There's so many tens of thousands of details you have to know to really understand it well. But this is really simple. This is broad strokes, and you understand holy war, jihad, Sharia, the caliphate. It doesn't, a semester and you could be an expert if you really studied it. So, by the way, you mentioned Indians. Of course, at one point, there was no Pakistan and Bangladesh, of course. India, in at least the modern world, included all of what is Pakistan today and all of what is Bangladesh today, of course. And so that was changed in 1947 and then 71 for Bangladesh. But before that, Islam kept moving through Persia, through Afghanistan. I don't know what that was called. Afghanistan was Buddhist, which shocked me. And then into India. And they ended up killing millions. I've read some of the historical accounts. Millions upon millions upon millions of Indians. There's so many people in India. Imagine how many people would be there
they
now.
Say hundreds of millions, which is so mind-boggling to even consider. But yeah.
So the stretch of it, we're talking Morocco and Spain. We're talking India, obviously most of the East at the very beginning, all the way up as far as they could go. I still don't know if the Armenians were affected, and into France. And so let's talk about the about tours. I heard a comment that it wasn't really that big of a deal, wasn't that important. I'm thinking, really? You don't think the Battle of Tours was important?
So for the longest time, from the time of the Battle of Tours, because we have near contemporary chronicles, it was seen as a watershed moment because Islam, and most people don't realize that. So while Muslims were coming in through Spain and attacking France and had reached Tours, in the eastern part of the empire, they were actually, this was the same time they were attacking Constantinople and trying to break through the east. So it was almost like a pinch movement.
Yeah.
And they were meet in the middle. So anyway, to most historians, up until maybe a century ago, it was a decisive moment. And had the Franks lost at the Battle of Tours, it could very well be. I think Edward Gibbon famously said that the Quran would now be recited in Oxford. And of course, it is now being recited in Oxford, but under different.
There you go. But of course, there would not have been in Oxford if they had conquered Europe that early. There, we would be living in a dystopian nightmare.
Right. Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
And now they they downplay
this. That was Charles Martel. I was thinking of brandy when that name. It's just immediately I think of some cognac or brandy.
Charles Martel, which means the hammer. He got the nickname Hammer because he actually, back then, the kings or the leaders would actually be in the fray of the fighting. So he was actually right there fighting alongside his men, and it's very picturesquely described in the chronicles with him smiting his foes with his hammer. But anyway, it's him against the
Kind of
Muslims
like
on the
Thor.
yeah, yeah,
Kind of
under
a
the
Thor.
leadership of under the leadership of Abdul Rahman, one of many of them. But a lot of it was Berbers. So it's ironic because the Berbers in the decades before the Battle of Tours were resisting Islam in North Africa and constantly fighting it. And they were amongst the most who were enslaved under Islam. But then they reached the point where, if you can't beat them, join them. And they became the greatest jihadis par excellence. And they're the ones who essentially conquered Spain. And most of the troops who fought under Arab leadership were Berbers, who were Muslims at the Battle of Tours. And but you're right. Nowadays, as usual, they try to minimize it. They try to cut off the religious element. Oh, there was just two warring tribes, some Franks and some Moors, and there was no religious. But again, if you look at the sources, it does come out as a religious conflict. And it's true. Muslims don't talk too much about it. It's known in Islamic history. I think it's known as the Battle of the Pavement, which is a reference to floors being so bloody. But it's also known that Muslims and other people don't exactly dwell on their losses and make it into a big story. They usually more hagiographically dwell and obsess over their victories, okay, such as the Battle of Yarmouk. So that makes sense as well. But anyway, it's part of the modern Western trend to minimize the conflict. And now they talk about it as just a raid. But that's not what the sources says. It was meant to be a conquest.
And what's important to me, of course, we all make our judgments. What is important to fix up in our mind is that they had already conquered, I don't know, 2/3 about at this time, I don't know, it's 732, but they'd already spanned, this great width of the world. And they were going to, now think about it. You go to France to visit, and this was a battle right in, like, if you have France north to south, Tours is right in the middle of the north to south, and it's on the western side. There's a battle there. If they had lost France, which I have problems with French people, but you know what? They deserve to be French, right? They deserve to stay French. Fought off Islam, and that's where the tide for a while started to shift. Had they already taken all of Spain, except for like just that little western section up at the top?
Yeah, this is the tide shifts in that now Islam is stopped and it can't go further into the west, and it
it's
is
a mental.
confined.
There's a victory. This is a good thing to have victory. When we're looking at Europe, the small victories, or like Poland standing firm, or Donald Trump, winning. These victories are moral. They reignite hope. We always have hope in the Lord, but they reignite temporal hope that yes, maybe things will turn back, and truth and justice and righteousness will prevail for a time. Tell me what you would say to Western leaders, legislators, presidents, prime ministers about how jihad of the last 14 years, 100 years, should inform how we think of immigration